Today's episode, the Bears still suck.
Welcome to another episode of Lombardi Time Brews. I am your host, John Del Rey. Today, we look ahead at Sunday Night Football when it's Packers versus Bears, and I'm going to be talking about the top 5 things that I'm looking for in Sunday night's contest. But first, hit like, hit share, hit subscribe, know whether you're on an audio podcast or whether you are on YouTube. Today I've also got the injury report for you. I purposefully held off on doing this video in the afternoon to make sure that I could have the most up-to-date injury report for the Packers as we head into Sunday's tilt. And we have 4 players who have been designated as questionable. 2 players who did not receive any type of injury designation at all in spite of leaving last week's game early with an injury. And that would be Quay Walker and Keyshawn Nixon. Neither one of them have any injury designation at all. They both should be good to go. However, the 4 questionable players, we knew this was coming: David Bakhtiari, Elgton Jenkins, John Runyon Jr., and Allen Lazard. In terms of how much they practiced today being the final practice before the game, we've got Bakhtiari, who is limited, Jenkins, who is a full participant, John Runyon Jr., limited, and Allen Lazard, limited. Now, Jenkins being a full participant certainly seems to put him on the trajectory to play Sunday night. Bakhtiari is a massive question. Given what LaFleur said about Bakhtiari not practicing 3 days in a row, even when he's perfectly healthy, he may always have limited practice designations. We don't know. This is a whole new world for the Packers and how they're handling injuries. I wouldn't be shocked either way. I mean, if we're sitting here Sunday afternoon and we hear that Bakhtiari is going to play, great. If we hear that he's out, okay. I'm just not going to be surprised either way, because all of the tendencies, all of the things that LaFleur and the Packers have done for years are essentially thrown out the window with this particular player and injury. Now, John Runyon Jr., we know he's still in concussion protocol, so he's at the stage in the protocol where he was allowed to practice today. Did that determine full versus limited? I'm not quite sure. We'll see if he's out there Sunday night. And then Allen Lazard turning in another limited practice since getting stepped on with cleats 2 weeks ago. Of course, we want to see Lazard out there, especially for that run blocking ability, but also just have a receiver who Rodgers trusts, who's in the prime of his career. I mean, Allen Lazard is going to be the de facto number 1 wide receiver for a reason. And the sooner they can get him back, the better it is for both facets of the offense, both running and passing. So we will see. Nothing has been said to this effect. It's entirely possible with an ankle injury, it'll be a game-time decision for Lazard. We won't find out for a couple of days yet, but there you have it. That is the latest update. LaFleur pre-practice in his press conference today was very short, very coy. Don't get me wrong, he was in a fine mood, but he was very, very limited in what he was saying. He was asked deliberately about Bakhtiari, deliberately about Jenkins, all about the injuries, and it was all like, we'll see. Don't know. We got to get through today. We'll see. So he obviously is not tipping the hand whatsoever. And the funny thing was, basically, once he got through those questions, that was it. Like there was nothing. The reporters didn't have any other questions, and so it was done. I mean, even at the end, LaFleur made some kind of comment that said, "Not all the questions today, guys." And there was a chuckle in the room, and that was it. A lightning fast press conference pre-practice today. So, diving in to the Chicago Bears, the most historic matchup possible in the National Football League. I don't need to spend a ton of time talking about the history. Everyone knows it. These teams go back quite literally 100 years. All the Hall of Famers, all the wins you any longevity type record in the NFL, you know the Bears and Packers are both going to be there near the top. Circulating around on Twitter, if you happen to head to my Twitter account today, just this morning I did retweet a full-on write-up of the matchups between the Bears and Packers put out by PackersHistory.com. Really well written, a lot of insight into this long-term rivalry relationship between the Packers and Bears dating back 100 years. It was a very good read. I would encourage everyone, if you want to look into the history, to head to my Twitter and check that out. I did retweet it this morning. So the Bears, just like last week, I mean, the Vikings were a team of change. And anytime you go against a team of change, there is a certain element of danger because you don't know what you're going to go against. Last week, the Packers were surprised by a number of O'Connell's schemes on the offensive side of the ball. Pair that with really, really lackluster execution from the secondary, and you get the mess that was last week. But the Bears, similarly, are a team of change. They've got a brand new head coach, a new GM, of course, a new coaching staff all around them, and one of the highest roster turnover rates in the NFL, which I'm going to be talking about shortly. For the draft this year, there was no first-round draft choice for them, but they still were able to draft 11 rookies. So I'm going to be talking about a couple of them as well. But the Chicago Bears, they hired a brand new head coach, Matt Eberflus, who was the defensive coordinator for the Indianapolis Colts prior to becoming the head coach of the Bears. Interesting little tidbit that I'm going to get out of the way right away. Head coach of the Bears, Matt Eberflus, and Aaron Rodgers have faced off a number of times. Only one time, though, with Eberflus being the defensive coordinator. Several other times he's been a linebacker coach, different assistantships throughout the NFL. He is a very long-tenured NFL coach, but only one time as the full-on defensive coordinator. And it's a game that I'm willing to bet most Packer fans remember. It was in 2020, Colts, Packers. Colts wound up winning 34-31. It was the game that the Packers ultimately lost, but afterwards Rodgers said that he felt good about the loss, and it really caught a lot of people by surprise. You may also remember that game because of some people consider it the MVS game, a fumble late in the game that helped change the tide. Ultimately, the Colts won that game, but Rodgers still performed well against the Colts defense, which is massively relevant for this weekend. In that game, Rodgers went 27 of 38 for 311 yards, 3 touchdowns, 1 pick. He does have some familiarity against this defense. Now, if you're looking at GM, the Bears hired a brand new GM, Ryan Poles, and their assistant coaching staff has a quite interesting and familiar face on it. Luke Getsy, former Packers quarterback coach, someone who Aaron Rodgers calls a close confidant and friend. Now is the offensive coordinator and play caller for the Chicago Bears. LaFleur was asked earlier this week, what is it like, Getsy taking basically your scheme, the Green Bay scheme, and going to a rival in Chicago? Do you think you're basically going to be going against your own offense this weekend? And LaFleur said, nah. Inevitably, as you change teams, have different personnel, you're going to change. And he suspects the same for Getsy. One big difference from Getsy working with Aaron Rodgers to now obviously working on the opposite end of the spectrum with an extremely young quarterback and a mobile one, Justin Fields. I mean, that's a big difference. You're going from Aaron Rodgers, 4-time MVP, downright old man, who used to be mobile but doesn't necessarily have it anymore, and now you're going against Justin Fields, ultra young, second-year quarterback, highly mobile. Getsy's bound to change some things in the scheme. So, going to be very interesting to see Luke Getsy call the plays against a defense that he should know inside and out because he worked with them last year. In terms of players, who are the players that the Bears brought in? Quite a few. Here's some of the key additions, veteran free agents that they signed. Lucas Patrick, former Packer. Equiminius St. Brown, former Packer. Byron Pringle, former Kansas City Chief wide receiver. Dante Pettis, former 49er wide receiver. Tajay Sharp, former Titan wide receiver. Riley Reiff, or Reef, I'm sorry, I always seem to say that one wrong. Former Viking offensive tackle amongst a couple other teams. And then N'Keal Harry, former wide receiver of the New England Patriots. They traded for him. But who are some of their key losses? And I'm just talking key losses because there's a ton of turnover on this roster. One of the biggest ones, Khalil Mack. He's no longer there. You will see no cheeseheads shed a tear about this. Khalil Mack is gone. Danny Trevathan, enemy of the Packers for a number of dirty hits over the years. Danny Trevathan is gone. And then Super Bowl hero from a few years ago, not with the Bears because they don't do that, but with the Eagles, Nick Foles. He was a backup for the Bears over the last couple of years. He has moved on this offseason as well. Recapping the Bears draft quickly, they had 2 second-round picks, both used on players for the secondary, one being Kyler Gordon, the other Jaquan Brisker, the safety. Both players started last week in Week 1 as rookies for the Bears. They spent their 3rd-round pick on Velus Jones, the wide receiver. Now, he has been listed as doubtful for Sunday's game, so I doubt that we'll be seeing him for the first time. And then another notable draft pick was 5th-round pick Braxton Jones, who started at left tackle in Week 1 for them last week and played a pretty good game against Nick Bosa and the 49ers. So those are their top draft picks. Going over last week quickly, the Bears did pick up a Week 1 win, 19-10 over the 49ers. Now, a quick caveat that I'm going to throw onto that game. If you watched any of that game, or if you haven't seen clips, I would totally encourage you to do so. That was football, is the only way to say it. I mean, they were playing in a monsoon. The field was falling apart. For the first time in my life, I saw by the end of the TV coverage, they were basically inverting the colors on the field where the white lines are supposed to be. The TV coverage made them black so you actually had a chance to see them. All of the paint was running off the grass, so the sidelines, the yardage lines, all of it just kind of smearing. I mean, it was really, really cool. It was true football in the elements. A rain bowl. But here's the downside. How much can you really glean off of that game? Because you know, when you're facing weather elements like that, of course you're changing how you're playing. So, what can the Packers really learn from Week 1? Not a whole lot, really. Sure, you can pick up on some tendencies, you can see some favorites, some trends, but really, are the Bears going to be playing the same game Sunday night on a what should be perfect Lambeau Field that they played last week in a monsoon? I doubt it. I mean, the team is going to look different. Just like the 49ers, I'm willing to bet, are going to look mighty different in Week 2 than they did in their Week 1 loss. So the elements certainly do muddy the waters in terms of how much we can learn from this Week 1 game. But a few things. Even in the Rain Bowl, the Bears only had 3 penalties count against them for a grand total of 24 yards. To counter that against the 49ers, who had 12 penalties. And you would imagine that playing in these soaked conditions, it's easier to get sloppy, easier to create penalties, and yet the Bears didn't. So, something to consider. Now, heading into this game, I did mention the injury to Velus Jones, who's listed as doubtful. Alex Leatherwood, the former Raider offensive lineman, who was cut and claimed by the Bears, he has already been announced as out. And then N'Keal Harry, one of the important additions for the Bears in the offseason, the trade from the Patriots, he's on their IR, so he will not be playing as well. Now, heading into the top 5. What are the top 5 things that I'm looking for Sunday Night Football, Packers versus Bears? I'm starting this off with 2 Bear-centric things, and then coming up later is the 3 Packer-centric things that I am looking for. And again, it's only week 2. So are you really looking at uber specifics, or are you looking at the overall picture? So number 1, who are these people? The Chicago Bears had one of the highest turnover rates in the NFL. And I don't mean like interceptions and fumbles. I mean roster turnover. According to overthecap.com, the Bears retained 32.8% of the roster. 32.8% was retained. The highest rates in the league were around 75%. 32.8. That means that 2/3 of this team is different than it was last year on their 53-man roster. 2/3. Over 20 veteran players were signed by the Chicago Bears this offseason, and they have 15 new Week 1 starters. You figure, Week 1 starters, offensive, defensive teams, you're looking at like 24, 25 guys on your teams can be counted as starters somehow. 15 of them were new for the Bears in some way, shape, or form. Be it they were playing a completely different position, being that they were on the bench last year and are starting this year. Keep in mind, Justin Fields counts as one of those 15 because Andy Dalton was the Week 1 starter last year. So this is comping Week 1 versus Week 1, but still, 15 players is no joke. That is a ton of turnover. And I say all of this because the Bears team under Matt Nagy that we got used to seeing in the last couple of years, it ain't these Bears. These guys are different. I'm not saying better. I'm not really saying worse. Although a lot of people would. But it certainly is different. Now, they did retain some real key parts of talent, and I'll get to that list of names later, especially on the defensive side of the ball. But, massive turnover for the Bears. The Packers, I would think, have to be walking into this game feeling like this isn't the same old division rival. New head coach, new GM doing different things a different way, new offensive coordinator who the Packers do know very well, but still new, and damn near an entirely new roster they're going to be going against. These are not the same old Bears. One thing I am looking for, though, and this brings us to topic number 2, is the old faces that the Packers may see. Luke Getsy, Lucas Patrick, Equanimeous St. Brown, a roster fringe wide receiver for the Packers, suddenly finds himself as the wide receiver 2 for the Chicago Bears. He played the second highest snap count for wide receivers for the Bears and was listed as one of their starters, opposite Darnell Mooney. So Luke Getsy, just how different is that scheme going to look? Lucas Patrick did play quite a bit in Week 1, but he was not a starter. He came in and filled in. Are we going to see him as a starter this week? So, very interesting, the old faces. This isn't as drama-filled. There's no Zadarius Smith. There seems to be, as there always is, more respect between the Packers and Bears. There's no traitor here. There's no one that the Packers fired who, Luke Getsy took the Bears job because it was a promotion and he can go call plays. He can be a full-on offensive coordinator. This isn't Mike Patton being fired and now going and helping the rival. This isn't Zadarius Smith being cut and now looking to get back at Aaron Rodgers. No, it's none of that. This is just straight up dudes who left. So, no dramatic post-game handshakes I'm going to be looking for. Now, turning it over to the Packers side of the ball. Are the Packers actually going to use their running backs this week? That would be neat. Aaron Jones, as we know, wound up with 8. 8 times he touched the ball last week. A criminally low amount against a division rival. I covered earlier this week that Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon had a lower user rate combined than Dalvin Cook had for the Vikings. Insane. Absolutely insane. The Packers have fully acknowledged that this is something they need to learn from and correct. I have talked about it all week, that this must be something that the Packers correct. One thing that we can learn from last week, going back and watching the Bears Week 1 matchup against the 49ers, is the Bears linebackers are taking to the philosophy of their head coach that we saw so often in Indianapolis. That the linebackers are working really hard to take away the middle of the field. So, If the Packers are going to be successful eventually with passing the ball, they must utilize the run to bring those linebackers closer to the line. If they allow the linebackers to play like they have a tendency of playing in Indianapolis, where they fade back, it's going to make life for the passing attack more difficult. So the Packers are going to need to use their run game to really make the linebackers commit. The running backs have to get the focus of the linebackers to open up the passing game this week. I would hope that the Packers are going to utilize their running backs in a more heavy way this week. They have to. Number 4 thing that I'm looking for. Is the Packers defense going to communicate a little bit better this week? You know, as the week has gone on, and I've talked a little bit about this, a lot of people have talked about this, you know, you can fault the Packers for not going man enough against the Vikings. But there is no denying that there were a number of plays that Joe Barry made an adequate play call, and the secondary especially just didn't do the job. There were a litany of miscommunications, broken coverages, and from a team that's invested so heavily in their secondary, it can't happen again. Now, they are going against a significantly inferior opponent this week. Justin Fields, even though he does show potential, cannot throw the ball like Kirk Cousins at this point in his career. Darnell Mooney is not Justin Jefferson. Equanimeous St. Brown is not Adam Thielen. We know these things. But still, the Packers secondary has to do their job. They can't continue miscommunicating and having busted coverages. Earlier today, Jair Alexander said he wants a shutout against the Bears. There's been too much talk about the defense. It's time to get a shutout. I'll take it. But that means the defense has to actually follow its scheme. Last week in the Rain Bowl, Justin Fields went 8 of 17, passed for 121 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 pick. But we know Justin Fields is mobile. And mobile quarterbacks have a tendency of really putting pressure on a defense's ability to communicate, especially if they're running complex zone. So, Packers are still going to have to communicate. Justin Fields last week, the numbers are meager, but the attempt number is high. He had 11 carries for only 28 yards. But in amongst that 28 yards, happened to be running for a couple first downs, couple broken tackles. Justin Fields can run the football. We know this. So the Packers' zone defense, predominantly zone, has to be ready. It can't break. And then number 5, again on the Packers side of the ball, mostly, the passing game. Obviously, the health of the offensive line will help to dictate how this goes. But going back and watching the film, we know that there were a lot more open receivers than there seemed to be on the telecast for Aaron Rodgers to find. The belief is that there were probably a few things as Rodgers watched the film, he's probably kicking himself about for not throwing it, not pulling the trigger. So the health of the tackles obviously will play a big part in how well the passing attack goes. Will the rookie wide receivers be more involved? I want to see another shot play against Christian Watson, or for Christian Watson. Like, come on, he dropped his chance in week 1. Give it to him again. Let him torch this Bears secondary. Speaking of the Bears secondary, the Bears have quite a bit of legit talent still on that defense. I know they only retained 32% of their roster, but parts that they retained, they're some of the cornerstones of this defense, even with Khalil Mack's departure. In amongst the retaining, you've got Jaylon Johnson, the corner, Roquan Smith, the all-world linebacker, who Rodgers talked about this week, Robert Quinn, one of the NFL's sack leaders last year, Eddie Jackson, who had his first interception last week in forever. He's still capable, but he's their safety. And then even last week, Dominique Robinson, a 5th-round draft pick for the Bears. He's an edge defender, and he showed up. He played only 20 snaps for the Bears last week and had 2 sacks and 3 pressures. On 20 snaps, it's no joke. So the Bears do still have defensive talent, even amongst this whole rebuild that they're doing. The Packers have to involve their rookie wide receivers, have to protect Rodgers. Rodgers has to have the vision to know where to go with the ball. He has seen this defensive scheme before and was quite successful against it in Indianapolis 2 years ago. So he has seen this scheme. We know he can execute against it, but can he get the ball to his receivers this week? That, more than anything else, will probably determine the game. Speaking of determining the game, I think it's time for the overall prediction. Those are the top 5 things that I'm looking at this week. But ultimately, who takes this one? Don't forget, hit like, share, and subscribe as this video is coming to a close. Also, just one pure logistical note, actually 2 pure logistical notes. Expect, hopefully I ran a trial test last night. I think it's going to work, so we will find out. But hopefully I'm going to have weekend content for the first time this week. I am filming a Madden preview, a Madden simulation where then you get to see me and one of my co-collaborators here doing play-by-play of the game. So be on the lookout for that this weekend. Like, share, subscribe to this video and this channel, and also head on over to Facebook. I've been talking about it the last couple of days. Lombardi Time Brews now has a Facebook page. Yes, it is still very underutilized as of right now, but more content is coming for the Facebook page. So, oh yeah, follow me on Twitter too. That too. But, final prediction. It's Sunday Night Football. It's in Lambeau. LaFleur still has not coached the Packers to back-to-back regular season losses in his career. The Packers are taking this one. Now, if they don't take this one, yeah, it might be time to be legitimately concerned about the Packers. I'm not saying full-on panic mode after an 0-2 start, but like if they can't beat the Bears, maybe it's time to start validating some concerns. Let's just say that. Like, let's not go too far, but that. But I'm calling them to win this game. They are going to walk in, like we have seen 1,000 times before. Packers are going to walk in feeling vengeful, feeling chippy, and they're going to put up a 34-17 win. 4 total touchdowns for the Packers, 2 of them being through the air, 2 rushing. But a 34-17 win, Packers over the Bears in Sunday Night Football. Thanks so much for checking out this video, this edition of Lombardi Time Brews. This officially closes 4 weeks now that we have been doing this podcast, so thank you so much for checking it out. We will be back this weekend, hopefully, with a Madden cast, and I hope you have yourself a great weekend. Go Pack, go.